Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Tonight's guest is Deist commentator David Robertson, who is a Libertarian.
Yeah. So how are you doing, my good sir?
Well, not too shabby. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Tell the dear audience all about yourself, and then we'll start talking about the recent madness that's been going on.
All right. Well, yeah, David Robertson. I am I don't know, I guess a teacher of leadership. I teach health science. I dabble in and study quite a bit, actually, deism. I'm more of a neo-deist, professional student, I think. I have website, a couple websites actually, hundreds of articles written on various topics from security to, of course, leadership, education, money, etc. Some weird, I think, things that I kind of debunk, common misconceptions, things of that nature. And of course, I have a podcast, The Disagreeable Thoughts and Philosophies of DMR. The whole point of that podcast is to challenge status quo, I think, in a lot of ways. It's called The Disagreeable Thoughts and Philosophies for a reason. My goal is to challenge at least something. My goal in that podcast is that something in that podcast is going to make you go, I don't know about that. So I don't know if I always succeed, but it's fun.
Yes. Like I said before the podcast, I got into your previous work on devout deism. You had said that, you're not very active on that channel anymore. I did notice that you had a bunch of books up that were somewhat related to that in politics. The one I wanted to get a hold of was your book on Trinitarian contradictions, but I couldn't find it.
Oh, yeah, the Trinitarian contradictions. So, yeah, there was a mistake that happened during the second edition, and we published that, and then we found out that the wrong file had gotten published. So that was out probably for, I don't know, less than a year before it was caught. And so we pulled it. Some people ended up with a unique copy, but what I plan to do as kind of as an apology, I think, to the public, there's going to be a third edition that is going to be published for free on my website, so everybody will have complete and total access to that. Again, as kind of an apology. So that'll have the description of the Trinitarian contradictions, and of course the third edition is going to be expanded considerably from the first. So you'll have another chance. I hope to have that out and on the website probably within the next. I hope the next 12 to maybe 15 months. So we'll see about that, but it will be for free. So
that's nice. I'd be glad to read it. I like your work, especially some of your political takes. You describe yourself as a constitutionalist. How would you break that down to someone that maybe doesn't know about politics?
Yeah, so I think a subsect of probably what I would describe myself as is a Jeffersonian constitutionalist, but how to explain that to most people today would be a challenge. There are a lot of people, in my opinion, that swear an oath or an allegiance to something they thoroughly do not understand and do not know. It's pretty hard to support, defend, love, or exercise something you've never read and couldn't recite if you needed to. And it's ironic, in my opinion, because I think a lot of people who swear that oath will, well, especially in light of Marbury versus Madison, which states that all laws that are repugnant to the Constitution are void. And yet we sit here and enforce and create law that completely infringes upon the Constitution. There's not a single right in the Bill of Rights that's not currently being infringed upon. Nobody bats an eye. So when I count myself as a constitutionalist, I would say that I not only am aware of what's in the Constitution, but I, brush up on it from time to time to ensure that I still have an idea about, what it is we're talking about. I wouldn't say that I'm, that I'm closed-minded to interpretations, but I definitely am aware of what the Constitution is. I'm aware of what the Bill of Rights were. I'm well aware of what our founders were, what their intentions were. And I think that's probably a unique experience for most deists. So, yeah, does that answer that question?
Yeah, that pretty much does.
What
Well,
do you make of the proposed Internet Bill of Rights?
What do I think of the internet?
What the proposed Internet Bill of Rights that people are talking about because of the recent censorship, allegedly.
Well, I mean, I get that people are going to introduce and try to, I don't know, to me it's irrelevant, right? So Jefferson made it clear that the Bill of Rights is guaranteed to all people, against all governments around. I mean, it didn't matter and what, no just governments refuse arrest on inference. I mean, it's pretty simple. It's a basic thing. It doesn't matter, right? Communication, expression, defense. I mean, it really, I don't know. It's irrelevant.
I personally think that the best thing that the government could do is stop subsidizing these big tech companies.
Well, yeah.
I mean,
if a company receives federal dollars, they then are subject to federal, what I would call standards, right? So if a company receives federal money like that, then they have to abide by the Constitution, in my opinion. I mean, the expression of thought, ideas, or whatever, I don't think is something that should happen if you receive federal funds. That's, I guess, the point.
Well, we know it means nothing to them because Jack Dorsey lied under oath.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't.
Shadow banning.
But then again, at the same time, I mean, it doesn't mean anything to most people anyway, because they most people couldn't recite the Eighth Amendment if their life depended on it. Somebody has a gun to their head. What's the Eighth Amendment? Or you die. They're dead.
All right, tell the dear audience the Eighth Amendment.
we have a gun on your head now.
Do what?
Nothing. Just messing with you.
So tell dear audience what the Eighth Amendment is. So
well, here's the problem with that. I don't like to tell people anything. Here's why. Norbert Schwartz found that if somebody has a misconception and you tell somebody what the accurate information is, all you're going to do is solidify the misconception. So really, yeah. So in fact, the way that I teach is through something called I could tell you that I teach through a process of question and misdirection. And the reason why, because again, if I'm sitting here trying to correct a misconception, all you're going to do is fight me on it intellectually. You may not do it physically or, verbally, but you're going to fight me on it. It's sort of like, okay, I will cover one, right? Because I think a lot of people, well, I don't know. Well, let me ask you before I make such a claim. Do you guys know what for instance, like the Ninth Amendment is right off the bat?
Not really. I mean, the only amendment that I really know about are the First and Second.
Okay. All right. So I'll kind of go over the Ninth real quick because the 10th Amendment, for instance, is basically power of the states, right? Well, the Ninth Amendment is one of those that says that just because it's not listed doesn't mean that it's not there. Right? Now that's left up to interpretation, which I think it's supposed to be. Right? And so, but you know, that's going to mean different things to different people. And I guess the one thing that I don't want to do is challenge somebody intellectually to the point to where they're going to block off the information. But if I do say something like, it's pretty hard to support, defend, or exercise something you do not know, I mean, logically speaking, inside, you almost have to agree with that. You know, would you agree with that?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, although that has never stopped a politician from running on it.
Well, right. Okay, so we talk about politicians, you know, it's like, why do we allow politicians to run the way that they do? You know, what's the difference between a democracy and a republic? And where in our documents does it say anything about a democracy? If people knew the truth and knew what the definitions were, what we would require from our politicians would be entirely different than what we require now.
Well, a lot of people don't know the difference between a democracy and a republic because they both say that the people can participate in the government.
Well,
I mean,
sorry, go
just
ahead.
as long as you remember that democracy is just two wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner, you're good.
You know, it's funny. I often tell people, I'm like, look, here's the difference between a democracy and a republic in simple terms. In a democracy, you elect leaders to make decisions for you. You're like electing a parent. In a republic, you're electing representatives to exercise your power on your behalf. One is about the leader, the other is about you. You are the leader.
Mm-hmm. That makes perfect sense. Yeah. And I imagine with the civil unrest that's gone on lately, we're getting a new president pretty soon. What's been your take on the Trump presidency for the audience?
Well, let me say this. I brought up the Eighth Amendment for a reason. And I think it's the eighth is going to be, I think, important in the coming weeks, months, maybe, based on the calls of the opposition of Trump. My take on the Trump presidency, I think I don't know. There's part of me that thinks that it's really odd that people were so opposed. There's other parts that I think it makes sense that they're opposed. But I also think that there's an undertone. There's this weird undertone in America though that people can feel, but they can't quite put their finger on. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say that, economically speaking, we were doing very, very, very well across the board. Was he bellicose? Was he a little arrogant? Was he, outspoken times when he shouldn't have been? Sure. But, you also think about too, like from a popularity standpoint between him and Biden, I mean, that's kind of an easy one. I don't know. There's a lot of really weird anomalies that just from a logical standpoint don't make a lot of sense.
What I find hilarious about all this is that everybody loved him before he started going after the establishment.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Well, I mean,
that's
people don't
right?
I mean, people don't realize that Trump was originally a Democrat before switching over to the Republican Party.
He's not even a true Republican at that.
Well, yeah, I mean, and I mean, think about who his best friends have been. I mean, but that's also not uncommon. I mean, you look at, for instance, Reagan. I mean, he was very much a liberal before he decided to play his hand on the conservative tickets. And it's but I don't know.
He was right about what was coming. like if fascism ever comes to this country, it'll come in the name of liberalism and political correctness.
Yeah, I mean, it's we're definitely in for some rough times. But here's the thing: I think it would have showed up regardless of whether Trump or Biden was in place. I'm a big believer in cycles, historical cycles, economic cycles.
Oh, speaking of the inevitable, what do you make of the Great Reset? They've been saying that there's it's been a process that's been going on since it was planned since at least the 90s, and Obama was on board with it, and then Trump got in the way and said, "Oh hell no, we're not doing that," and that's why they started going after him. Or is there more to it than that?
I'm sure that there's probably some elements of truth to that for sure. As far as what it is and what's ultimately going to be. Well, I mean, it's sort of like the digital wallets, digital currency, and trying to force negative interest rate. There's that's the only way they can do that. But also too, I mean, nobody really, that's the problem, I think, with Americans being so introverted and self-centered. When we think about a technocracy and where that could go, and you look at places like Estonia, who have been testing it out for quite some time, and how that could work. And I mean, I don't know. I think it's interesting to me to see how easily distracted a lot of people are and get all worked up about things that are really irrelevant in the grand scheme of things, while the things that are very much going to impact their lives, they don't mess around with because of the complexity of the matter at hand. And then of course you've got the media that is going out of their way to misdirect astroturfing techniques, which of course confuse people even further. But I don't know. I guess we now live in a world where, reading anything more than 250 characters is frowned upon. I mean, it's people don't read, people don't research. We're interested in tribe mentality and instant gratification. It's a terrible recipe.
Well, yeah, the Americans tend to have a very short attention span, and it's never been more present than we can see with the aftermath of the Capitol riot.
No, I once believed that the internet was going to make everyone smarter. How wrong I was.
Well, that's the thing, all right? So information has always been available, but it's what is somebody willing to do to acquire the information? It's a unique situation where intellectualism is still, well, we were talking about that before the show started. Intellectualism is one of those things that's rare for a reason. And unfortunately, you could go back to Pareto's principle, the 80-20 rule, the 20% of what we could call elite, right? Either by intellectualism or money or whatever. There's always going to be that select few, and there's always going to be the ignorant mass. Mm-hmm. And so we get to decide which of those teams we're on.
Mm-hmm. That's a big thing that I've often found, that in the critiques of a democracy, that's a general thing that people do bring up, is that in many democracies, they tend to cater to the lowest common denominator, which would be, in today's modern age, is the low information voter. Where economicist named David Freeman, who's the son of Milton Friedman, he said that there's many people that, it's not, like you said, the information is there, but the personal cost of acquiring it is more than the actual reward in many people's mind of actually having it.
Well, knowledge is power. Power is not created, it is transferred. So if people feel powerless, it has everything to do with their inability or their, we could call it lack of desire to acquire the power. Um, for thousands of years, that was the quest. And somewhere along the line, people, I think I know what it is. I mean, we could look at the Google effect and, understand that people aren't going to store information long term because they now have been conditioned to find it at their thumbs, but not realizing that the algorithms are contorted. So, but it's even more than that. I think that the worst thing in the world is, in my opinion, the inability to question and seek out contrast, blindly follow. It's these weird concepts that happen through tribe mentality that I think are a detriment to not only the person individually, but also the future collectively.
And that's the problem with this whole new atheist movement. That religion is on the decline. Like, it's not on the decline. It's just it's giving way to a new religion on the far left, and all the woke shit and this gender madness and all this far left authoritarian bullshit.
Yeah, they're ideas that are easy to wrap around. The complexities of what we have to do to affect change on a massive level, or even to go back to where it should be, seem insurmountable, right? I mean, it's so big, so why not complain about something small? That tends to be what happens with those type of situations, unfortunately.
Yeah, so
it's easier to complain about the law than it is to fix the decrepit house.
yeah, I remember what was so funny is that I've said like the Democrat and the Republican Party to give a perspective from a comedian named Lewis Black. The Democrat Party is the party of no ideas, and the Republican Party is the party of bad ideas.
Well,
and
No, that's not so sure.
Well, yeah, maybe not. That was a couple years ago, so we might have to update that. But that is something to think about.
George Washington said in his farewell address that the party system would tear us apart. Nobody wanted to listen to him, but he was absolutely correct. But but that's part of the problem, right? So we live in a system that we rely upon the authority to provide an education that is contorted. If we don't have accurate information, we cannot make accurate and impactful decisions. People are confused about the founding. People are confused about things like slavery. People are confused about even things like World War II, the Civil War, the Revolutionary War, trade, economics, the dollar, currency, whatever.
And basic biology and math.
Basic biology, yeah, science.
Well, if I've always made this joke, I said, "What's the difference between Thomas Jefferson and Robert E. Lee?" Thomas Jefferson won.
I could see that. Maybe.
Well, I mean, if you like, I've always found it,
And the difference between George Washington and Abraham Lincoln is that the latter freed the slaves while he was alive.
Well, technically,
the latter after he died.
Well, technically, I've always said that the Lincoln never really freed the slaves. He just gave the government a monopoly on it.
Yeah, basically.
Because, I mean, if you look at the amendment that frees the slaves, it says, except in cases of, criminal cases. Like, so whenever you say slavery is bad, except you're going to get there, there was a lot of what people fail to realize with the slavery situation is that the amendment that freed the slaves was abused very much after the war.
Yeah, and much of the slaves went right back to their masters because they had nowhere else to go.
Well, I mean, it wasn't just
To
that;
work,
it's that
to work for them, not to be slaves, but to, work for them and get paid for doing it.
well, it's not even just that; it's that the amendment made the exception for prisons. Like, if you were arrested, you could be made to do prison labor. And what ended up happening is that some southern states took advantage of that. And what they simply did is they made it very easy for black people to break the law so they could put them in prison and do forced labor.
Back when systematic racism was a thing.
Well, I mean, you know, to me, I've always said that there's a difference between systemic and systematic racism.
Tomato, tomato.
Yeah, well, I mean, well, there's a difference in the M. Like, systemic racism is just noting the fact that there are differences between the races in terms of socioeconomic factors. Systematic racism is noticing that and plus inferring that it was deliberate.
My point stands.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I mean, I've always said that, I mean, if we're going to be serious, are we going to say that there's systematic racism against white people because white people disproportionately make up the serial killers in prison?
Well, they're trying to do that now.
Yeah.
Well, but even that I think is a little bit contorted. Um, what is a white person?
Basically anyone from the South.
Because if you were to look at what makes up the Caucasian race, for one, it doesn't include Celts, and two, a good portion of Caucasians are actually not white at all. They're very, very dark. Some are even black.
Mm-hmm.
So, when we look at, again, it's just one of those things. It's like Aryan, right? Aryans probably, sported Mongolian features.
They weren't
the idea of being anti-Semitic, being a Semite, that's speaking a certain language.
You're not just against Jews; you're against people from the Near East in general. But they limit it to Jews somehow.
Yeah, and then that's what I mean. And then what Jews do we want to talk about if we're going down that road? Are we going to talk about the black ones? Are we going to talk about the dark ones, the white ones? I mean, how do you want to approach that? It's just, again, there's just so much unbelievable ignorance, and it literally, that ignorance is what drives division. And it's amazing to me because if people knew the truth, certain truths, they wouldn't be divided at all. In fact, they'd be united against the one entity trying to make them ignorant. It's sort of like the idea of, a lot of people, think about like the Trail of Tears. That one cracks me up because, the Trail of Tears, it was this horrible thing. Well, yeah, when you inflate the numbers like has been done, yeah, that appears to be a horrible thing. But when you understand timelines, then you realize that, the Cherokee had a lot of people who died on that trail, but then they turned around and owned over 4,000 slaves with the money that they were given. So how do you reconcile that?
It's the same with the Spanish Inquisition. They still believe the Protestant propaganda against the Catholic Church and exaggerate the number of people tortured and killed during that, and it spanned over a few centuries.
Well, and I guess that's kind of my point, right? I mean, well, I don't know. We're also talking about, we live in a nation where most people don't even know that Benjamin Franklin started his life out in servitude. I mean, and that's just kind of a weird thing. We should know these things, and we don't. And it's unfortunate because, it changes the discussion in a way that it shouldn't. But
yeah, and there's also Washington, Lincoln, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela. People treat them as these infallible Jesus figures, even though they all had skeletons in their closet, and these were not perfect guys by any means.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, to be fair, I will take ownership and say that I was one of those people that pretty much idolized Martin Luther King Jr. and put him on like a throne. And I was a bit disappointed later on in life when I found out some of the shady stuff that he did. Um, like plagiarizing his doctoral thesis, cheating on his wife, apparently multiple times. And, so I always think that, nowadays you always have to do generally have to realize that while there are people that do good things, you have to realize that they're also humans and they do bad stuff as well.
Oh, then there's Christopher Columbus, who's polarized. People say he's this brave Italian explorer who discovered America. Then there's the other side who say he's a genocidal maniac. Like, there's nuance between that most people don't bother to check.
Well, knowledge is power, right?
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, and I've always just said what's funny is that people will, they'll utterly condemn Columbus, but then they'll be praising Leif Erikson. And I mean, Leif Erikson was a Viking.
He was a Christian Viking, though.
Well, he was a Christian convert from, a Christian. He converted from paganism into Christianity. But
Yeah.
I mean, what's funny about that is that he was a Viking, which, these are not people that are, particularly known for their non-violent ways.
Yeah.
I mean,
But
they,
in all fairness, they did get their asses kicked by the Indians and were driven out.
yeah, pretty much. But I mean, like, I've always just found, it's just like, we'll condemn Columbus because he had bad relationships with the Native Americans. He enslaved, many people got enslaved because of actions that he did, et cetera, et cetera. But then we're going to praise Leif Erikson, who, what did he do? He conquered lands, enslaved people, and, he did the exact same thing, just at an earlier time.
Well, not the
Well, I
exact
mean,
same
but
thing.
look at the irony of that. I mean, look at Chief Seattle.
Yeah, and I remember a good article that I was reading from your site, David, is you made an article on the Confederate flag in the statues. I can't remember the name of it, but you went into the history of how it was used and how we shouldn't, you know, let bad groups of people dictate what the meaning of a certain symbol is.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's sort of like there was a statue taken down just a few weeks ago of a slave that was in front of Abraham Lincoln, and so it was taken down because they were like, well, that's a slave kneeling before Abraham Lincoln, and that shouldn't be. Well, that's not what it was. That was not what was being depicted there. What it was, and that statue was actually paid for by freed slaves, and it was actually a picture of a slave rising out of slavery. And because people don't know it, they again, ignorance wins again.
I don't know what point there was in tearing down Lincoln statues and Douglas of all people. Like,
I mean, I like as much as I like to say it's about morality, it's really communism, specifically the I can't remember the Pol Pot version of communism because
well,
what's the thing
yeah,
that
yeah.
Pol Pot did? I
Funny
mean,
enough, they left the statues of Karl Marx alone.
yeah, but I mean, the thing is that's funny about that is that like it's like Pol Pot communism because what's the thing that Pol Pot was known for? His people he wanted to advocate a system where they basically, you know, took away the past, like burned the history books, took down all the old statues, and so, we can only live in the present, the moral present, and make our own future.
That's what
which,
most. That's what most of the dictators did.
yes, I mean, that's basically what's going on, in my opinion, with the statues. As much as they can dress it up, that it's in some moral language, when you really get down to it, that's what it really is. Um, like, well, guys like Robert E. Lee weren't perfect by any stretch of the imagination. I'm like, Robert E. Lee was probably one of the most moderate people you could get on the slavery issue.
Well, he and his wife actually educated slaves to get them out of slavery.
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I also like to point out that in his situation, the reason why he ended up fighting for the Confederacy was basically because his options were very limited. Um, like, he basically had three options. One, he could join the Union and kill people in his own, like, where he was heralded as a hero at, and just people that he had known his entire life in Virginia. Two, he could join the Confederacy willingly, or three, he could join the Confederacy unwillingly when they would eventually have conscripted him into the army anyway. He knew he was going to be in the war one way or the other, whether he liked it or not. So he figured it was much better to get on his own terms and just sort of, uh, just to do it on his own terms and just wait it out. And, say what you will, but the moment that the war was lost, he didn't, he accepted defeat in stride. And if it wasn't for Robert E. Lee in general, I don't think that the South and the North could have reconciled as easily as they did.
Well, the North would have dominated the South anyway because the North was industrial while the South was agrarian.
Yeah. Um, but yeah,
It
anyway.
wasn't entirely a noble cause because when you have industrial, you no longer need the slaves, so it's pointless.
Well, I mean, it's not.
Slavery was on its way out. I mean, that's the thing.
Yeah.
I mean, look at the technologies that were being produced in the South. It was going to go away.
It would have. I think it would have eventually. Now, of course, the South, tried, like in their constitution to maintain it. But I've said, what the politicians say on paper doesn't mean anything when it comes to economic realities. They care about one thing only, and that's getting elected and making a buck. If slavery became unprofitable, they would just grit their teeth and get it over and end it.
Oh yeah, and just so some people in the audience are confused, why didn't the founding fathers get rid of the slaves if they knew it was wrong?
Yeah. Would you have an answer to that?
George
David?
Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and them.
Is that a question to me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. No, that's. Well, I guess it depends on which one, but most of them were abolitionists. They absolutely hated it. It's interesting because the probably one of the most ignorant things I've ever heard is the founding fathers were great, but they ignored the evils of slavery, and nothing could be further from the truth. Um, for instance, Thomas Paine, he wrote an article called African Slavery in America, which denounced the African slave trade in in a major way. In fact, it's funny because if you were to look at the Declaration of Independence, or if you know the history there, most people come across the idea that Thomas Jefferson's declaration was revised and he was upset about it. Well, it's the part that was revised out was a part where he was telling slaves to rise up against their masters. They were very, very much against it. A lot of them were, but it was also an economic norm. I think a lot of people. Well, I mean, you could get into the Thomas Jefferson's wife Sally's situation in a time when he wasn't allowed to get married. He freed his children, but didn't free her because that was a binding document that no one could take her away from him. In lieu of a marriage, in the church or whatever, he had a binding document that wouldn't allow anybody to take her away. But we're also talking about an economic norm where, the first legal slave owner was a black person. There were white slaves. There were white slave owners. There were black slaves. There were black slave owners. In Louisiana alone, there were over 3,000 black slave owners. And they owned slaves disproportionately to that of whites. There were red slaves. There were red slave owners. Again, I mentioned the Cherokee before. Cherokee owned over 4,000 slaves and fought for the Confederacy. It's really easy for us to look back and go, well, they say they did this, but then they participated in that or whatever it is. Well, it's no different than today. I don't think that we like our reliance on fossil fuels, right? And someday people are going to look back on us and go, well, why did they do that? But I don't care how against fossil fuels you are. I bet I can go through your house. I bet I can find you in a car. I bet you I can find something where you're using a whole bunch of fossil fuels because it's a part of our economic norm, And when you look at the words, for instance, of Thomas Jefferson, when in reference to slavery, he wanted to let him go. In fact, he was creating laws to stop the spread of slavery. But his number one,
It didn't stop him from sleeping with them, though.
Well, the one that he fell in love with and had children with, yeah.
Yeah.
So he had an interracial relationship when it wasn't, I should say,
popular.
Yeah, that's a good way to say that. And I think that speaks.
Then there's George Washington. Like, why did he wait to die until his slaves were freed?
Well, yeah, and that's the thing. Not all of them had the same opinions of, for slavery.
Well, I think to many of them, like Robert E. Lee, for example, he eventually believed that slavery was going to come to an end. It just had to. His only thing is that he believed that it would come in time, like once Providence would take care of it eventually. He just didn't believe that time was the right time for the South to get rid of it, because he felt that they were so economically inclined to it that they wouldn't be able to survive without it.
Yeah, speaking of Providence, we're supposed to be talking about Deist stuff. All right.
Well, yeah.
On the okay. Is your idea of God closer to the fathers of Washington, Jefferson, and Franklin's idea of God, or closer to Locke's, or you go on?
Okay, so as far as deism goes, when you look at Jefferson and Ethan Allen and guys like that, you're looking at more of classic deism, which believes in the 5 articles and things of that nature. That is definitely not my form of deism by a long shot. But all deism is generally related, right? So and I consider myself a neo-deist. So while it is, the same foundation, it's definitely different. So I would say that close, but no, because classic deists believe in light intervention, and neo-deists generally do not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I always said that's interesting. So obviously many deists start off in a more, like typically in America, they start off with a more Christian background. What was your background before coming to deism?
I would say I was a lost Christian, kicked out of the church at 12 for asking the wrong questions. Yeah, that broke my heart. I went to my grandmother's church, and there was a guy, Cecil, very old pastor, and he was just a great guy. But when I started asking questions, as I got older, I started asking questions. I actually overheard the conversation where he's talking to my grandmother, telling her to pretty much not let me come back. And yeah, it kind of broke my heart. I was sad by it, but I'm kind of glad in retrospect because it put me on a path to boldly question everything, including the existence of a God. And of course, stumbling upon through history, I was reading Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, and there's a part in there where he says, "I then became a thorough deist," and I was like, "What is that?" And then started to study there, found Thomas Paine, and then eventually found Ethan Allen's Oracle of Man, and just kind of spiraled from there. So,
I mean, a funny thing that people generally tend to think of with Thomas Paine and stuff is they seem to think that he died broke and pretty much despised by everyone. Which, you know, for one, the him dying broke is not really true. He, I mean, if you look at his residence, it's always been worth a pretty good chunk of money, and it was still, so he had property and he had wealth. He did like he did lose some friendships because of his book, The Age of Reason. Although, what's funny is people don't understand the reason why he wrote that book to begin with. Like, his entire reason for writing it, because originally it came in two parts, and he wrote one of them while he was in prison, and he was complaining about, you know, how France was getting into radical atheism, and he was writing that to come, he was writing it to combat the radical atheism in France, along with, poke holes at the church that he felt was complicit in that.
Meanwhile, the new atheist
so why was he in
concentrate
jail?
on his.
Well, he was apparently in jail because I don't know, because he was always a known, let's say, provocative person. Um, he would write he was a well-known author. He would write articles, and he tended to rub people the wrong way, especially some people in higher up positions. That was ended up getting him in trouble. So I mean, that was a reason why the first part of his book was really written. But the second part was written as he got responses from religious people, like from pastors and stuff, from it. His book was such a rage to many people that that legitimately governments, like I believe in Britain, banned his book. They prohibited people from reading and discussing it, and they even arrested one of his publishers because he basically challenged the status quo. So I mean, Thomas Paine was hated by the French and the British,
And the
and
Americans.
yeah, he was pretty much hated by. He was a very well-known provocateur. He said what he said, and he meant what he said, which is, I think that's probably one of his better qualities is that he wasn't afraid of pulling punches with anyone, and that got him much heat. Although I always like to say what's funny is that when I look at some of the criticisms that he received, I feel many of them were pretty much stupid, and it came down. The reason why many of his fellow contemporaries that he worked with condemned him because not so much that they disagree with what he was saying, is that they were they were embedded in the church, like there was church politics going on, and his work was being very controversial in churches, and the church leaders of there were pressuring politicians. And so, of course, the politicians felt like they had to do something about it. And that's sort of where, I think some of his hatred was. Although I think, overall, it's a bit overrated to say that in the long haul, he took a great big hit. He still died relatively wealthy and did a great deal for his life given what he started out with. Like, I've always found it funny is that we have a big focus on education in this country, but if you've seen the education level of many of the founders, you'd be surprised.
Yeah, a lot of especially a lot of people nowadays get their information from Hamilton.
Mm-hmm.
What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, again, it's misnomers throughout history. I think, they say that winners write the history, and that's not always true.
Survivors write history.
Yeah, yeah.
The ones that die, they don't write the history, but the one so you might get a loser that writes, but they only write because they weren't executed.
Well, again, I think we're very I think we're a very narcissistic nation, and we have an inability to ask the right questions. We're never taught how to ask questions. The history that we're taught is not the history that a lot of other people are taught. The history that is available is not the history that a lot of us get to examine, and it's unfortunate. It's very unfortunate. So contrast is key, right? And we also have to appreciate how things can be relative. Perspectives, I think are also important to examine. And we often lose by not including some of those perspectives. It's sort of like how, just a really quick example, why didn't we bomb Tokyo? Why did we bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki? If people understood why, they could correlate some of the things that are happening today with what happened then, and to be able to reconcile some of those ideas.
We bombed them because they bombed us, and we hit them 5 times harder as an example to the world not to fuck with us.
Yeah, but why Hiroshima and Nagasaki? If let's say Kansas and Florida were mad at each other, you bomb 2 small towns instead of the capital. Why would you do that?
Isn't it because that Hiroshima and Nagasaki were economic centers?
Well, no. If you were to look today and see who owns northern Japan, that's where your answer lies.
That makes sense. I mean, what people also fail to realize is that we sent leaflets, like I think a while back, in telling them, "Hey, we have nuclear weapons. Clear out." And they didn't take it because I guess they didn't believe us. Well, they didn't believe the people then.
Oh yeah, do you see any another note? Do you see any parallels between the political instability of today and what went on during the French Revolution?
Parallels between the French Revolution and today. Yeah, I would imagine there's probably some.
Or the events that led up to it.
I'm sorry?
Or the events that led up to it.
Well, maybe. I mean, history repeats itself, right? I mean, so yeah, you're going to see elements of that. But it's ironic because out of the French Revolution and today, I don't know. I mean, I see more correlation with even recent history. When you factor in propaganda, you factor in astroturfing,
Soviet Russia and Maoist China.
Yeah, right. I mean, so you begin to see some, and especially when you factor in motivations and things like that. I mean, you really don't have to go back far However, what's interesting about going back into history, as far as finding solutions, you could read Machiavelli.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you read Machiavelli, you'll find that that's pretty much the idea. That was the ideology of the mafia.
Yeah, he believed that all men are evil and that will act on their nature given the opportunity.
Which, in retrospect, was he really wrong?
Well,
as G.K. Chesterton said, that original sin is empirically verifiable, given human nature.
So I'm curious. You asked the question about the French Revolution. I would be interested to know, like, what are your thoughts there? What were you thinking? What were you seeing?
No, what all these right-wing conservatives are paranoid about, like, well, they censored the president. What else can they do? They're making this out to be a power grab and a coup d'état.
Oh, yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
They act like this is unprecedented. Like how can you censor the president of the United States? Like, well, they chopped the king's head off.
Yeah.
So, I mean, really, is it so? I mean, I've always just found it sort of funny is that, I mean, this is a sort of, I remember Benjamin Franklin sat in a court and was very bored and he fell asleep. And I remember one objection that he had, like, when they were talking about what kind of government they had, monarchy was quickly brought up, and they said, well, if we don't like the king, then what we're going to have to do is we'd have to kill him. And that sort of got out a big laugh. And they, the idea of a monarchy was just quickly unfolded. No one wanted to go back to that. But I mean, I always said that, well, that is true. I also said that's probably, in a way, a monarchy is sort of better in some situations than a democracy, because, like I've said, that in a democracy, I mean, a bad president worries about his job, while in a monarchy, a bad king worries about his life.
Oh yeah, speaking of the education system's so bad here, and speaking of Franklin, a lot of them still think that Franklin was president because his face is on $100 bill,
Mm-hmm.
and every other dollar bill has a president on it.
You know, even though
He was just an ambassador.
Well, yeah, and even that, and he was old, really old, when he could have even gotten the opportunity to become president. And another thing is that he hated politics. Like, as much as he did it, he absolutely loathed it. He didn't like being in political meetings whatsoever.
Well, he got to live in Paris for a time.
Oh yeah, but I mean, he did not like it. He didn't like politics whatsoever. Like I said, he fell asleep in a political meeting.
He was quite the character. He was also a ladies' man.
Oh yeah, he was rich. So I mean, of course. But anyway, we're coming up on the hour mark. You know, I figured, so we're going to go into just a few little things to end up. What's been your opinion on the Capitol riot? Like, what has your take been on it?
Well, I would imagine that. I mean, I don't know if this is. Well, I'll just say that clearly the video and the videos that I've seen and the narratives being formulated do not match. There was no, in the videos that I saw, there was no storming. There were, there wasn't any coup. There wasn't any of that stuff. And I think, again, we're looking at a carefully constructed situation where I think people are being manipulated and they should question.
Mm-hmm. I mean, like, for one, you have in many, like, I find it really hard to believe to call this a coup, because, I mean, it seems more like a riot because the people were very unorganized. And what did they really do when they got into the Capitol? They broke a couple windows, they threw some papers around, and they took selfies.
And it was it was not Antifa. There were no Antifa members there, despite them wanting to push the blame to the left.
Well,
If,
I mean,
if
I
it
mean,
was if it was Antifa, there wouldn't be a Capitol building left.
well, true, but I mean, like, I wouldn't be surprised if there were some Antifa members scattered about, because Antifa, if they're anything, they're opportunistic. But, you know, it mainly looks like it was Trump supporters. Now, if it came out tomorrow that there were some Antifa members scattered across here and there, I wouldn't be that surprised because Antifa is just opportunistic like that. But to put the blame on them for this particular thing would just be against the data.
It's also the way the media portrays it. They portray that this is unique, this is unprecedented. They're domestic terrorists, but while Antifa and BLM have been burning cities for months, they just praise them as heroes and justify what they're doing.
Well, I mean, what's funny is that I've funny enough have said that I've given credit to the Capitol rioters for this. They had a problem with the government and they went to the government for their anger. They went to the source of their problems. Now, was what they did constructive and right and righteous and viceful? No, not at all. But I mean, but is it more good than, let's say, Antifa burning down private businesses that had nothing to do with the police shootings?
Oh,
yeah, it's pretty bad all around.
But it's their only answer is whataboutism. That's all they can come up with.
Yeah, but because here's the bad thing about the whataboutism or the tu quo fallacy is that we're not saying that, because the BMLM activists did it, therefore, and no one complained about it, therefore these Capitol Hill riders do it, then therefore they're not bad. No one's making that argument. What we're saying is that there should be logical consistency in our outrage.
Anyway, what are your thoughts?
I'm just saying, if we're going to be outraged over violence, political violence, we should be equally outraged no matter what side the rioters are on.
Yeah, I was about to ask Dave what are his thoughts.
Well, it's interesting. There's a couple ways you could look at it. I would tell you that the data on quote unquote anti-fascists not being present is inaccurate for a couple of different reasons. For starters, you could look at, well, I'll just tell you there's an interesting situation that kind of came about. There's a guy named John Sullivan. He's the founder of an organization called Insurgents USA or Insurgency USA. I think it's Insurgents USA. And he's been not only seen in numerous videos there, but he's also been seen in a lot of photographs that were taken there. And that group is based out of Utah. Anyway, so he was there, and on his website, he had actually organized an event to coincide with that exact event at that exact time. And so his whole thing was that event was to kick fascists out of DC. So was he the only one? I don't know. I mean, Occam's razor suggests probably not. But that changes the narrative considerably. And that's not to say that it was all Antifa and whatever. I mean, my whole thing from the ground up is to what end? What was the point of any of it? What was it expected to change? So
they're just fed up because now the Democrats have absolute control over everything. And
sure.
now that conservatives will be reduced to disenfranchised peasants in an authoritarian regime.
Well, perhaps, but I mean, not necessarily the first time, and it's not the first time it hasn't swung the other way. I mean, I think, sensationalism is a big part of kind of what we're seeing, and it's unfortunate, right? Because then it's an all or nothing situation.
Well, yeah, it kind of did happen because with the disgrace of Nixon, the Republican Party was pretty much dead by at that point. But then it bounced right back with Reagan, and he was their new savior of sorts.
Sure, yeah, right. And so, but look at the last 2 decades, how many times, for instance, like the Republicans, keeping in mind, of course, I'm not a Republican or a Democrat.
Right.
I don't subscribe to that, but look at how many times the Republicans have had total power, where they've had the House, the White House, and the Senate, and what did they do? What have they gotten done? Since 1912, we've seen just a few constants, and one of which has been a continuation of policy from one administration to the next, and a continual reduction in liberty and a continual growth of power from the government.
They haven't done a whole lot because the right has been losing the culture war for the last 100 years.
Yeah, but even when they have the opportunity to switch that, they don't. And again, that goes back to the constants. We continue to see this continual growing beast of government, which is very much inconsistent with what our founders were trying to accomplish. I mean, and that's, again, it goes back to what we were talking about at the very beginning. When we do not know what success looks like, what it is we're after, what we're trying to achieve, it's really hard to keep it or to chase it. That'd be like telling me, or me telling you to go find success when I don't really describe what success is for you. All right, well, what does that mean? What am I going to go do? Well, I don't know. You figure it out. Well, okay. Success to you isn't necessarily success to me. If we're not on the same page, we got an issue.
Yeah, it's a good point. Well, we're a little past the hour mark. Would you like to tell the audience where they can find you at?
Sure. Probably the easiest way is through my website, dmrpublications.com. That's dmrpublications.com. I've got, hundreds and hundreds of articles there, access to my podcast, things of that nature there. Again, that's where the Trinian Contradictions will be released on there as well. And of course, it covers a variety of topics. Same as the website, or same as the podcast, we cover usually 5-ish topics a podcast. That's once a week, but that's probably the best way. But again, disagreeable thoughts and philosophies. It's going to be one of those things that I challenge for a purpose. And my method, as I was trying to describe earlier, is through a process called cognitive disfluency. I try to make things a little bit harder than they need to be, so we understand the lesson a little bit more clearly. So yeah, there's that. And thanks guys for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it was nice having you. Maybe we can do this again sometime in the future.
Okay.
All right, you heard it. Go follow him, and see you next time.